In 1984, America received a national treasure. It was not Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA album, the first CD album released in the United States. It was not the launch of the long-time trivia game show Jeopardy! And it was not Reagan's 49-state stomping of Mondale in the November presidential election. It was Daniel LaRusso's victory over Johnny Lawrence in the All-Valley Under-18 Karate Championship in San Fernando, California. Raise your hand if you know exactly what I'm talking about. A few of you, wonderful. This non-historical event, of course, took place in the hit film The Karate Kid, released in June of 1984. The film follows the classic hero's journey plot. You meet a character who has a problem. He meets a guide who gives him a plan and calls him to action. The plan results in triumph. It's every good story. The hero of the story, Daniel LaRusso, would not have been able to succeed in defeating his bully were it not for the wisdom and training from his martial arts sensei, Mr. Miyagi, the beloved Mr. Miyagi. In the 5th century AD, monasticism was an immature movement throughout Roman Gaul, modern-day France. Each ascetic, like those living during the biblical period of the Judges, did what was right in his own eyes. Richard Goodrich explains, every ascetic did as he or she thought fit, following the whims that appealed to an untrained mind, rather than looking to a broader framework of established practice. This movement required a sensei, a master, someone trained in the tradition who had spent years studying and practicing that renunciation of sins. Someone who knew not only how to teach students what to do, wax on, wax off, but someone who also lived it out themselves. As Philip Rousseau describes, Cassian was to assist a program that was already underway. In this paper, I will describe the practical ways that John Cassian brought order to monasticism in southern Gaul. This requires some description of Cassian's life, journey, and writings. Second, I argue that his practical theology of holiness was undergirded by an inherited theological tradition that should not be considered heretical. Two camps exist that are dismissive toward Cassian's theological positions. Contrary to the common dismissals of his theology, Cassian proves to be a powerful source of theological teaching on a variety of subjects, including hamartiology, anthropology, divine sovereignty and grace, and Christology. This is exemplified in his defense of the Catholic Creed in his De Incarnatione Domini contra Nestorium, on the incarnation of our Lord against Nestorius. Consequently, we should understand that Cassian's view of holiness, of which much of his reputation is based, is entailed by his rigorous theological framework. Cassian was born into a wealthy family, likely in the area of Scythia Minor, modern-day Romania, sometime around AD 360. He had a good education and was fluent in both Greek and Latin. As a young lad, he and his friend Germanus traveled to Bethlehem, where they spent not more than a few years. Shortly after meeting an Egyptian named Hunuthius, they were highly impressed and decided to pursue an invitation to Egypt. It was there that Cassian became devoted to the ascetic teachings of the Desert Fathers, as is evident in his two works, De Institutis Cinobiorum and Collationes Patrum in Scetica Eramum. I'm trying my best with the Latin, so forgive me if I mess up. He would reside in the desert of Scetis west of the Nile Delta for over a decade. There remain disagreements as to why he left, but he and Germanus moved to Constantinople, where he was ordained into the diaconate by John Chrysostom. This occurs sometime between 399 and 404, between the start of the anthropomorphic controversy in Egypt and John Chrysostom's exile. The two companions then spent several years in Rome, where Germanus died. During this time, Cassian had become friends with Leo, who would later become Pope. In the final season of his life, sometime in the early or mid-410s, Cassian moved to southern Gaul to assist a fledgling monastic movement. He founded 2 monasteries in Massalia, modern-day Marseille, one for men and one for women. Monasticism was growing in Gaul, but it had been at present without monasteries, and also lacked guidance. Cassian, unlike his contemporaries who spoke more theoretically, provided practical guidance for the renunciation of the world and sin. For, quote, "These things cannot possibly be taught or understood or kept in the memory of idle meditation and verbal teaching," perhaps like a lot of what we do here at ETS. "For it depends entirely upon experience and practice." For Cassian, you had to live this out. Edward Gibson observes that, as a disciple of the Desert Fathers, Cassian's long residence in the East and his intimate knowledge of the monastic system in vogue in Egypt made him at once looked up to as an authority and practically as the head of the movement, which was so rapidly taking root in Provence. Immature Gallic monasticism required order and obedience. Cassian's wisdom provided the bedrock for it. His mission was simply this: to provide the best foundation for the emerging monasticism of southern Gaul. In Cassian, we have a person conversant in matters both east and west, and this provided him an opportunity to bring his Eastern experience to the fledgling monastic movement in Gaul. Cassian himself attests to these considerations. Quote, "He referred rather pointedly to the perfection of the Egyptians and to their rigorous teaching and practice, which was, he said, beyond imitation. He felt that he himself was dealing with men who, because of their total neglect or half-hearted endeavor, are less acquainted with this degree of purity." End quote. Cassian's Institutus and Collationes are the 2 sources we have for analyzing how Cassian brought monastic order to Gaul. The Institutus details the rules and structure of monastic living, which he had learned from his time spent in Egypt. The first part of this work addresses proper attire, nightly and daily scripture readings, and the singing of psalms, and the reasons for a well-ordered life. The second part addresses the 8 cardinal sins. In this work, Cassian gives instructions such as what a monk's garb ought to be. This may appear mundane to us, but to Cassian there is a reason for everything. His reason for rejecting copious manner of dress is that the collective wisdom of his predecessors warns that such clothing contributes to vanity and pride. One of the social observations of the ascetics is that some of their clan would wear sackcloth to demonstrate how holy and how righteous they were. "Look at me, how holy I am, how holy righteous I am." This brought about vainglory and pride. So a uniform policy helped to prevent these sins from occurring. The Collationes, written in 3 publications, are a collection of teachings from the Egyptian Desert Fathers. Cassian offers his conferences as a way for the new monks of Gaul to overhear the great monks of Egypt, speaking as they did back home, though now, of course, in Latin. The stories are a retelling of the teachings through a question from Cassian or Germanus in answer format. Whether these answers were the exact answers, perhaps from memory, or embellished, fictionalized to some extent, scholars do not know for certain, though generally we think that they're ahistorical. So Cassian was not attempting to provide a rigid history of the Father's answers to these questions. Owen Chadwick explains, "The conferences therefore do not provide us with substance of the teaching of 24 abbots. Rather, we ought to view Cassian as someone who was seeking to build Western monasticism, and less an historian than more so an architect, selecting and adapting his materials. There are 24 conferences which present a coherent and complete, though not a systematically structured, guide to the monastic life or perfection." Cassian himself admits that the conferences are adaptations for his new milieu, and thus we should not be interpreting them as historical in nature. For example, he modifies even the wardrobe, the types of cloth you could wear, because Egypt was a lot differently a different climate than in Gaul. It was colder in Gaul, so it required a different type of material. So he allowed for flexibility. What matters to him to pass along, when one moves from incidental remarks about Egypt to the narrative level, Cassian's theological intentions predominate. For him, history is in the details, and the bigger picture is theological. What matters to him is to pass along the theological tradition which he inherited. In this next section, I'll explain and challenge two camps of thought that are dismissive toward Cassian's theology, each for differing reasons. The first dismisses his theological framework as a contrived bridge between Augustine and Pelagius, and ultimately heretical. The second dismisses his theological framework insofar as it was merely handling practical concerns of his day. Augustine Cassidy rightly observes these patterns of interpreting Cassian, referring to them as the theoretical perspective and the practical perspective. Keep those two labels in mind, theoretical and practical. Both of these camps failed to grasp Cassian's rich theological tradition, which informs his practical theology of holiness. The theoretical perspective treats Cassian's style as more analytical and systematic. Reformed theologians especially have had a tendency to interpret the so-called semi-Pelagians, with Cassian as their representative leader, in this manner. Charles Hodge believed the Gallic monks were so influential upon the Roman Catholic Church that the doctrine of original righteousness arose out of the semi-Pelagianism of the Church of Rome and was designed to sustain it. Louis Berkhoff believed that between the extremes of Augustinianism and Pelagianism, a mediating movement arose, which is known in history as semi-Pelagianism. Historian Paul Johnson wrote, Cassian was a scholar who steered a cautious middle course between Pelagianism and Augustinian determinism. Anthony Hoekema believed that so-called semi-Pelagianism necessitated a first act by the human. Montgomery Hitchcock opined, the weakness of the semi-Pelagian position lay in its ascribing the beginning of salvation to the free will of man and not to divine grace. Joseph Tixerant described the so-called semi-Pelagians as thinking that man is able, without grace, to desire and will, but not to perform supernaturally good deeds. He can begin to believe, but he cannot impart to himself complete faith. And finally, Roger Olson, semi-Pelagianism became the popular theology of the Roman Catholic Church in the centuries leading up to the Protestant Reformation. These theologians perceived Cassian and his school of thought as creating a middle ground between Augustine and Pelagius, as if his beliefs were novel and attempting to appease both sides of this classic debate. The theoretical camp has a truncated approach to reading Cassian. It does not take his writings on their own terms, and instead applies that's Cassian's framework, into their debate. But Cassian does not fit neatly into their debates, for at least a couple reasons. First, he was not writing a theological treatise. Second, his own beliefs do not fit neatly into binary categories, as I have argued elsewhere, specifically in that he held to the concurrence and necessity of grace for every good action. Furthermore, there is little to no appreciation of Cassian as a student of a theological tradition from the Egyptian desert fathers. You simply don't see this sort of background work performed by these systematic theologians. Believing that he attempted to build a bridge ad hoc between Augustine and Pelagius is a shallow interpretation of his life, journey, and writings. In fact, it makes one question whether or not the primary sources written by Cassian were even consulted. Finally, this approach is quick to judge Cassian without giving him a hearing. This is unlike the way that classical Christian authors, such as Thomas à Kempis, Ignatius of Loyola, or others, are treated. Why should Cassian's ascetic writings be any different? The practical perspective, on the other hand, does not view Cassian's framework as a threat to systematic theology, because he was not writing about systematic theology, but rather simple monastic living. Cassian, quote, gave more importance to the teachings of teachers and spiritual guides who taught from their own personal experience of Christianity than to the boastful disputations of those thinkers who, like Pelagius, tried to show the way to the completion of virtue through more pure theological speculation. I did a little bit of paraphrase there for those following along with the quotes. Peter Munz's description of Cassian's writing appears descriptive and non-judgmental, but he was exclusively concerned with giving practical instruction and advice. His style was discursive, and his method of writing, from a theological and philosophical point of view, both unsystematic and non-technical. That's fair enough. That non-neutral description is fair enough. However, this has led some other scholars to dismiss a priori the doctrinal beliefs of monks as less than serious. For example, Dunstan O'Keeffe has written, "Whatever Cassian's ultimate view, we have here a question of personal temperament and outlook, not one of doctrine." Gerald Bonner, using slightly different language, remarks, "The difference between the views of the semi-Pelagians and Augustine might be explained as being due to their different pastoral experience. Cassian and the Massilians looked to the Egyptian desert, whereas Augustine's was theological and sacramental in nature." Anthony Kenny observes a distinction between being a preacher and an ascetic rather than a speculative theologian, and that the Massilians were afraid that Augustine's doctrine might cause negligence or despair in the faithful. Finally, in simplistic terms, Augustus Neander writes, Cassian sought to grasp the doctrines of religion with the heart, rather than with speculative and systematizing thought. These theologians perceived Cassian and his school of thought as merely an ascetic saint who made a strong contribution to Western monasticism. To their credit, more so than the theoretical perspective, the practical camp does read Cassian upon his literary intent and purposes. Even still, the practical camp has its shortcomings. First, Cassidy recognizes the interpretation, quote, leaves the readers with the impression that there is an irreconcilable difference between the systematic concerns of the theologians and the practical concerns of the monks, end quote, a tension which ought not exist. How ought a contemporary reader to evaluate Cassian after reading the Colossianes? Wow, I'm feeling quite challenged to work out my sanctification now, but I shouldn't seriously consider the truthfulness of what Cassian writes. This is the tension that's created by the practical camp, that the practical theology is good, but it's not really supported by good rigorous theology. That's a concern when we read Cassian in that way. So it leads to a cognitive dissonance. Owen Chadwick similarly notes, to many, his moralizing and homiletical instructions have appeared interesting only to monks, while the monks themselves have been circumspect in their dealings with one whose name is tinged with the faint flavor of semi-Pelagian heresy. Interpreting Cassian's writings as ascetical and practical, and thereby rejecting them as theological or doctrinal, does a disservice to the belief that the practical is the application of the theological. Further against the theological-practical distinction is the fact that both Augustine and his Gallic opposition were monks. Augustine and Cassian both were seeking to put to death the desires of the flesh. But in theological reflection on experience and in controversy, Augustine and the monks of Gaul moved in opposite directions. Their vocations cannot be the contingent factor that set apart their theological differences. This is to say, we can't simply dismiss the Gallic monks because they were doing monkish things when Augustine himself was a monk. So shouldn't we just dismiss Augustine because he was a monk? So this approach to interpreting Cassian and his company simply doesn't work. The Gallic monks did think theologically about many topics. Consider that Cassian's 23rd conference on sinlessness is a robust reflection on the sinlessness of man and the necessity of divine grace for salvation. Background, audience, and genre do not serve as a basis for belittling the theological merits of writings from certain monks. Besides, this attempt to distinguish between them cannot explain why some monks in Hadrometum were convinced of Augustine's views, while others at Gaul were not. Instead, we ought to understand Cassian's doctrine in light of his context and upon his standards. Given that we know some of the Gallic monks objected to Augustine's doctrine of predestination and grace, why would an Augustinian standard be the standard to understand and describe what Cassian's position was? This is not to say that we have to agree with Cassian, but we first must rightly understand what he believed before we can agree or disagree with it. Some scholarly attempts to understand the doctrinal beliefs of the Gallic monks have come from self-admittedly Augustinian viewpoints. For example, Dunstan O'Keeffe writes that he will interpret the monks, quote, using Augustine's doctrine of grace and free will as a yardstick, end quote. Thankfully, it seems that many authors of recent theological scholarship from the past 20 or so years, maybe a little longer, or so have not prematurely dismissed Cassian's beliefs on the basis of their ascetic style. Stuart Skiles recently described, just back in 2019, that the cloud of suspicion around Cassian seems to be evaporating. Some, this author included, that's me, have argued that their theological beliefs should be interpreted within their own right, without coming to their works with an Augustinian lens. When they are understood in this way, these monks are seen not as semi-Pelagian, a theological boogeyman term, but rather more accurately in the same branch as the Eastern Church Fathers. Now, debate exists in the scholarly community over how to assess Cassian's relationship with Augustine. Is he friend or foe? Time prohibits a treatment of this discussion, but when we take Cassian's writings for what they are, we can and should still recognize them to be a threat to what I call later Augustinianism. Conference 13 is where he turns his full attention to the interplay of human effort and divine grace. Conference 13 was not explicitly written in reply to Augustine, but rather as part of a broader project of Cassian's to equip and train others for the monastic life. It's impossible for Cassian to have been replying directly to Augustine's final letter to Hadramedon and Prosper and Hilary in Gaul, written towards the end of the 420s. Conferences 11 through 17 were dedicated to Honoratus, who was presiding as he does over a large monastery. Honoratus became bishop of Arles in 426, so this segment of the conferences must have been completed before then. Otherwise, Cassian would have referred to him as bishop and not one overseeing the monastery at Lourdes. Columbus Stewart has it right. Quote, because Conference 13 fits so well in the overall scheme of the conferences, it is better seen as a general response to aspects of Augustine's thought, already well known in Gaul, than as a tactical move in response to Augustine's latest works, end quote. Yet to view Conference 13 as an attack on Augustine or Augustinianism is to see only out of one eye. For Cassian certainly also sees another error in his midst, Pelagianism. In fact, it is Pelagianism which garners most of his attention. The anti-Pelagian trends that recur right across Cassian's writings are particularly dense in Conference 13. It is the supposedly anti-Augustinian bits that are unusual. The conference is devoted to the necessity of divine grace, an issue not with the Augustinians, but with the Pelagians. Consider Cassian's remark that there is a profane notion of some who attribute everything to free will and lay down that the grace of God is dispensed in accordance with the desert of each man. Certainly a reference to Pelagianism. So while it may be that Conference 13 fits as part of a larger puzzle for the monastic life, nevertheless, it might have been the case that Cassian was considering competing views on grace and free will. This would include his familiarity with Augustine's doctrine, or supposedly an extreme version of it, in mind when composing this conference. For instance, Cassian wrote, "For we should not hold that God made man such that he can never will or be capable of what is good, or else he has not granted him a free will, if he has suffered him only to will or be capable of evil, but neither to will or be capable of what is good of himself." This remark stands in contrast to the later Augustinian doctrine of inability and serves as evidence that Cassian was critiquing both of the positions he believed were outside the scope of church tradition. Now to the fun stuff. Let's consider just one example of Cassian's writings of his robust theological framework by looking at his defense of the Catholic Creed in his De Incarnatione, the only Latin work from that era written against Nestorianism. At last year's meeting of the ETS, Brian Litfin, who has joined us in the audience this afternoon, delivered a fine paper titled Mapping the Geography of the Word Catholic in Early Christian Creeds. Therein, Litfin presented the data on the history of the term Catholic as it appears in creedal formulas. He charted, appendix number 1, for those that have the handout, the appearances and categorized them into 2 blocks, the Eastern block and the Western block. The term Catholic first appears in creedal formulas in the East and later in the West. But notably, it's absent in what Litfin calls the central axis. Central axis. He presents this query: how did the word Catholic become widespread in the Eastern bloc, then eventually leap over a sort of no man's land and enter the Western bloc, like a spark of a forest fire crossing a man-made fire break? Indeed, how did this occur? What plausibly explains how the term Catholic goes from Theodore of Mount Suhestia in the city of Antioch all the way through the central axis and over to southern Gaul, where it is seen next in the writings of Faustus of Fries? Litfin settles on the theory that the Lorenz Abbey, located off the coast of ancient Gaul, near today's Caen, was responsible for the first slop-over sparks that brought the creedal use of Catholic from the East to the Western Church. He supports his conclusion for 5 reasons. First, there is a handful of early sources placing the term in wide use within Gaul. Second, the earliest uses in the Western bloc come from southern Gaul. Third, Vincent of Lorentz, quote, was nearly obsessed with Catholicity, end quote. That's a true statement, Brian. Fourth, the Lorenz community is aware of Eastern Christological debates, chiefly pertaining to Nestorianism. Fifth, Litfin, like many other scholars, holds that the Athanasian Creed originated in and around the Lorenz community and is titled in the manuscript tradition as Fides Catholica. All of these points reasonably indicate the term Catholic being used in southern Gaul, but it does not explain how the term got there. To this, Litfin holds that the term, quote, spread throughout the East via the prestige of the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed. But how could it be that the prestige of the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed would fail to effect and instead catapult over the central axis? This broad solution should be set aside in favor of a more specific solution. John Cassian, a courier of the Catholic concept. I tried alliteration there. The word term works best, but hope you enjoyed the alliteration. As further proof of Cassian's orthodox theological chops, he was asked by his friend Leo, who was still archdeacon, to write a critique of Nestorianism. Certainly his highly ranking friend would not have asked this of him had Leo not known of Cassian's ability to craft a theological treatise. This work was written sometime after the third portion of the conferences, completed between 426 and 428, and also before Nestorius' condemnation in 431, leaving only a couple years for its drafting. Check out Litfin's 4th point regarding the Southern Gaul community knowing about Nestorianism. I can see you like where I'm headed here, Brian. It bears so much resemblance to Vincent's Commonitorium, written just a few years later, that Rousseau claims not only did it match so well, this is Cassian's De Incarnatione, not only did it match well with Cassian's treatise on the same subject, Vincent even spoke with Cassian's voice. That's Rousseau. Check out Litfin's 3rd and 5th points above. So the biggest astonishment here from De Incarnatione, Cassian's work against Nestorius, is that the work contains more than 20 uses of the term Catholic, 8 of which refer to the Catholic faith, and 2 uses of Catholic creed. The most relevant cases come from Book 6 of De Incarnatione, which includes a thorough treatment of the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed. Cassian quotes the creed in Book 6, but he cuts off the ending, so you don't know if he uses the word Catholic in the creed itself. He actually writes etc. He doesn't complete it. So he describes the creed as this: the creed which gives the faith of all the churches and encompasses, quote, the faith of the whole Catholic law, end quote. Chapter 10, Book 6, we see that We see then two men in you. Do you get the joke? We see two men in you, a Catholic and an apostate. First a Catholic, afterwards an apostate. Determine for yourself which you think you ought to follow. For you cannot press the claims of the one in yourself without condemning the other. Do you say then that it is your former self which is to be condemned, and that you condemn the Catholic creed and confession and faith of all men? It's a joke. There's two men in Nestorius because Nestorius thought there were two persons in Christ. So Cassian's playing a game there. Chapter 10, book 6, last quote from Cassian here in this portion. For now you say, if we should say, I believe in God the Word, the only Son of God, begotten of the Father, of one substance with the Father, who came and was buried, who would not our ears be shocked at the sound? Do you see then how you are utterly destroying and stamping out the whole faith of the Catholic creed and the Catholic mystery? As one can see, Cassian's De Incarnation includes not only many references to the Catholic faith and the Catholic creed, but critical, relevant references as it pertains to that prestigious Niceno-Constantinopolitan creed. So, while Cassian is not a source that explicitly states Holy Catholic Church in reference to a creed, he is in the right place at the right times, writing with language that provides indirect evidence toward the conclusion that he was the courier who delivered Catholic in creedal form to the West. Who else in Christian history spent a substantial amount of time in the East to learn the creeds and then traveled to southern Gaul, specifically in the first half of the 5th century? Litvin started this significant puzzle, and I'd like to think he now has the final piece. When I alerted Litvin to Cassian's writings and the potential they had toward his project, immature monks, and basically build them to be the next generation of church leaders. So you take them out of the world, they learn the ways of being a monk, and then they go and become the bishop of a certain city. So it's a great way of basically training Christians how to live the holy lifestyle and putting them then into church leadership roles. A question here, let me know, is this the last question?
Goodness. Maybe one more question, but I know we have.
And then I'll stick around.
As well.
Yeah, I think you should probably emphasize the motif of purity part.
Yes.
I mean, that's really it. It's not just getting out of the world. It's about a transformation of the heart through humility, obedience, and everything else. Yeah, and that question kind of led, it seems like in this paper you're talking about the ways in which Cassian is oftentimes interpreted, many times unfairly, and the Catholic piece. I was going to ask, I was trying to understand how that fits with your title of the paper.
Very good question. Let me scroll up. So Cassian is seen that is this guy who comes along. The title would fit more with the first section about his life and journeys and how he basically brought order to this immature Gallic monastic movement. And so some of it was describing, so for some more experienced readers in this field, some things that they already knew. Others was perhaps for folks who have been not as familiar with it. And so, yeah, it just deals more with that first section. So, yeah, I could have taken the paper in a different direction, going more toward the period of heart, which he does write about in a major way. So there's a lot to say and write on for Cassian. So I wanted to take it a direction that I thought might be helpful toward bridging the divide that I see between the systematic theologians and the historical theologians.
We do need to call it. Thank you very much for attending.